One question I have, Yolanda, is about a year ago, I moved back to Bethnal Green after leaving there for several years. And there was a huge transformation, not in the streets, because they were still terrible, full ambulances, it was very loud. But there was the whole East London, everyone working from a cafe. There was 5 different places you can get a coffee within a 1-minute walk. It was quite vibrant and it was very local. And I wonder, is the local centre in the home, are they going to be the new office?
Yes, that's what I was. Well, we're talking about lots of different office spaces now, but yes, that's what I was trying to get at. When we say we're going to work at home, what we actually mean is we're going to work in our neighbourhood. And if I pop out with my laptop to the local barista, I'm just dying to have a properly made flat white sometime. But anyway, we go out and sit down and be with other people, even if we don't talk to them. So sometimes we just don't want to be sat in the same room, and I think all of us are probably fairly tired of the rooms that we're working in at the moment.
Great. And Mike, building off of Yolanda's discussion about streets and talking about public realm, I was just wondering, like, obviously London's moving quite quickly ahead with adding pedestrian space. And hopefully other places, I know Brighton, I think, was one of the first places to partially pedestrianize the seafront during 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. We'll see more and more of this. Obviously, there's comments so far in the chat saying that there's not enough pavement space to physically distance, because the pavements are too small. And there was the UCL study saying, I think 36% of UK pavements are wide enough for that. Do you think this will be permanent? And do you think we can make this permanent? How do you envision the future with this?
Well, I think, we've already seen evidence in the past of, prototyping changes to streets through more temporary measures. And that's been, going around for the last 15 years. So we're not unknown, that's not an unknown thing. And I think that's going to be a tool that's going to be used more immediately, because it's the most fastest, cheapest, quickest way of getting these spaces adequate to support people. But the beauty of it is, as well as this is, a city prototyping trial. When do you ever get the opportunity to change a whole city's infrastructure on an instant to cater for this COVID crisis? So, behavior change is going to be very much fundamental to this catalyst. So, you're going to allow people now for the foreseeable future, let's say maybe 8 months, 12 months, to cycle to work, because they're going to have huge dedicated cycle lanes that allow them to travel through the city of London, the city of any place in probably, in the UK. And so as soon as you start to do that, the ownership of that space changes. And I think this is the moment, really. And Yolanda said, we're fast forwarding 10 years. I totally agree. It's an exciting period in what is a very sad period. So, it's a contrast, but there's a silver lining to this thing. And COVID and climate change are 2 very evident challenges facing our cities. And carbon reduction is going to be centered around vehicle reduction. And so, we're looking at these 2 elements of our carbon footprint and our kind of on this virus. And we're thinking, well, we can actually probably solve 2 of these in quite a quick way if we kind of rethink the street, and that only has to be done through a lick of paint and a few pot plants to just get going, and then that can then change the whole perception of what those spaces are. So it can be fast and furious, I think.
It's great. Sorry, one thing I'd just like to sort of add to that is streetscapes. Density was mentioned earlier, and I think we're going to have to rethink density in a far more qualitative sort of way, rather than just being people per hectare. Actually think about the quality of the denser spaces. I mean, I was very struck by how different it was to hear people yelling across the sort of vast spaces between the big towers in Wuhan versus singing to each other around a courtyard from their balconies. I mean, you wouldn't have had quite as high density in those Italian cities, but that is they would have been by European standards high density living spaces. And there's just so much difference between those 2 different urban topologies. And sometimes, of course, the point block in the landscape is actually lower density than the mid-rise sort of street and courtyard scape that people were singing or Sol Mio to each other across or whatever. But it makes a huge, huge difference to the quality of life, the type of density you do, not just how dense in numerical terms.
And also, Yolande, there was lots of talk about urban density, and a lot of people, whether from the governor Mario Cuomo saying, well, of course it happened in New York first, the huge outbreak because it's so dense. But actually the biggest outbreak was in Staten Island at first. And then you compare it to Hong Kong where it was quite low. So there's more a greater consideration of crowding versus density. So except for high rise, I guess my question is, would high rise residential really end in the sense that it's a lift capacity issue? And once that's resolved, is that okay then?
I think that, well, the threats to high-rise living were already starting to emerge and will increasingly emerge. So without going into too much detail of how finance and money and value is going to change over the next few years, my expectations are that the costs of living in a high-maintenance, high-rise block, which costs significantly more to just do almost everything in, but if you consider they need recladding, the lifts need replacing every 30 years, the sinking funds, the service charges that are needed for high-rise blocks compared to sort of a mansion block, for example, is very significant, and was going to become more significant in an era of low capital growth anyway, as people just consider how much it's costing them to own a property. And hold a property. I think we were going to start seeing a lower demand, frankly, for big box. Even not just high rise, but big box sort of landscaped type homes compared to simple street based ones. So this is another layer on top of it. If we start thinking, oh my goodness, what happens in a lockdown? I can't get in the lift because of physical distancing, either have to walk up 10, 12 stories or whatever it is, or just wait for ages for a lift, then that will start to shift demand basically away from certain types of properties.
Okay, great. I have one quick question for Vinita, then we're going to go to Stefania, who has their hand raised. But Vinita, I saw a short film on it was a BBC film, and it was called "The Town That Beat Loneliness" or something like that. And talking about how through social care and connections, they really were able to have this outreach program, especially for older single people that felt quite isolated. And I started wondering how we built silos and how architects do their thing, urban designers, the ever-loved transport engineer does their thing, versus the social side of things. How much do you think is it a social issue of changing our behaviors, and how much is built from environments, looking at the mental issues of housing and loneliness?
Yeah. I think you made a very good point, because in your question itself, you're talking about integrated thinking, which is lacking these days. I mean, firstly, there is the one part of things where we're still talking about zoning. And then when we talk about housing, we are separating tenures as well. So when you talk about this high density living or even mansion block living, if we start to think about typologies in an innovative way, where even kind of studios work really well with older people's housing, we specialize in a lot of older people's housing, and the problem I have is often these are isolated blocks inserted in a master plan, but not really integrated because they feel they've got special needs. So I think the more you integrate typologies in an area, and obviously there is also that issue of mixing tenures. So for certain parts in London, for example, they work really well, certain boroughs, because there's a mix of tenures. In one street alone, you'll see lots of private housing and you'll see affordable housing, and it works really well. But when you start to isolate tenures, there is that big problem. And I think more and more you're going to start seeing not just a mix of densities, but also a mix of typologies and tenures is important, which is what helps you with that social connectivity. So for example, private homes. Lots of people are working, they're out of their homes. But in affordable homes, lots of people are still at home. There is a joblessness. So you start seeing a different community feel, and we're trying to promote that on quite a few of our master plans. And as Yolande said, this is a problem that has already started creeping up before the COVID-19. And I don't think particularly, high densities or those kind of settlements have contributed to it. I think in areas like ours, for example, I live in a little mansion block. And what's really interesting is, although there are just 8 homes per block, there is a community liaison guy, and we're all connected with each other. And at the moment, we've got a WhatsApp group. But we've started to use our little courtyard, which is a dry, overlooked kind of space. And suddenly that has become a space where the community is coming together. We're all starting to kind of grow herbs. Everybody's looking after each other. I've got a 70-year-old neighbor. In fact, I was breathless earlier because I was trying to get to the door and look after her. But these are the networks that start to develop when you build buildings in a way where, if there are 8 flats per core, there is that connection. But the minute you start thinking about high-rise, high density, and it's a different typology, you don't even land up knowing your neighbor. So it's about how you start designing these things in. When you start thinking about buildings, you're not just talking about, there are 35 units per core. There's going to be about 180 in this development. Hang on a second. How are people going to interact with each other? If you're talking about deck access, or if you're talking about cores, what means are you creating for neighbors to start to interact with each other? It's that macro versus micro. I think, that whole journey all the way from the street to your door is quite important. You getting to know your neighbors.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I find it interesting. The only time I ever met my neighbors in the 15 years I've lived in London was when I lived on a street of terraced housing, and it was a garden flat, the converted basement level, and it was the only time I met people. It was quite interesting how typologies actually affect sociability. Thank you.
Can I just interject? Be wary of calling mansion blocks or saying that big blocks are going to be higher density. Some of the highest density neighbourhoods in London are made up of mansion blocks.
Absolutely.
That is actually how you get the high density. You don't. Yeah. This is true in city after city right across the world. It's mid-rise. I mean, the highest density neighbourhood I can find in Europe is Paris, and it's all mid-rise sort of Haussmann type facade. Yeah.
But it's the high density that works. It actually allows you that social interaction, whereas those taller buildings, they're just not a long-term sustainable model because they're just not built for that interaction.
Yeah, agreed.
Good. We've had a question from Stefania. If you want to unmute and ask your question to the panel.
Hello all. I'm not sure how it fit. It may or may not fit with what's been said just now. This was just a thought, and I just want to put it out there. Maybe someone has an answer. So a lot of people are choosing where they live based on where they work. So you want to be close to your office, and then sometimes you move away from family or your country in order to do so. But if, in the scenario that more and more people are going to be working from home, is anyone predicting a disurbanization in a way of people moving back to family or maybe closer to nature? Or, you don't need to be in an apartment in London when you can be maybe by the beach or, in your original country or whatever. Is anybody, have any thoughts on whether cities will maybe become less urban and less dense if to fit it into the previous discussion?
Good question.
Well, I've been talking about cities becoming much more dispersed, and the idea that you've actually started to see in New York and London and Paris, there's been net out migration of locals. The only thing that has kept New York and London growing is international incomers. And Paris has lost population. The reason for this is that people are seeking out alternative, good urban alternatives to London or New York. So in the case of London, people are going not just to, say, Bristol and Manchester, but also to, small towns like Glossop or Hebden Bridge, or small cities like Derby, and not just Canterbury, Guildford, Oxford, Cambridge, but there is already in train an urban dispersal. Now, what this remote working has showed, not only that we can do it, but some companies are actually actively wanting to have people work at home more often. They're wanting to either go I've heard of one architectural practice go completely over to remote working, others thinking about satellite offices, or boosting the satellite offices that they've already got. So this much more mixed sort of mode of working actually enables people to go and live where they want to live. And frankly, for young people especially, to be able to go to saner housing markets elsewhere in the country. So it's almost as if the idea of the global city is spreading, but it's showing up in little pockets in a much more geographically dispersed way. And I think we're going to be, our idea of what a city is will change as a result of that.
And for me, that's interesting to think about the opposite as well, where we've built these residential areas of house after house after house, where nothing's within walking distance. Equally, what will happen to those places? Will people stay there? Will they move out to somewhere that's a little bit more neighborhoodly, have other mixed uses in it?
At the risk of hogging this, I mean, it's something I've thought about a great deal. People talk about retrofitting, and retrofitting is usually thought of in terms of sort of repurposing housing or making it more environmentally friendly and energy efficient. I think we've actually got to think about retrofitting our neighbourhoods to urbanize them. So this is where the planning piece comes in. We've got to think a lot more flexibly about what a planning use class is, and think about how we repurpose some buildings for a much more diverse range of uses. So I think we can potentially we will have to start to think about how we save those godforsaken sort of housing estates which are completely car reliant. And the answer, I think, is to get more mixed use, so that it will start with home working, then creating demand for the local cafe, the local shops, or whatever. And so long as, well, the more competitive places are going to be those where the planners can respond to that need to urbanize the suburban or urban, mixed use and flexi use in otherwise single use places.
Great. There was a question from David Greenfield. I don't know if he's still around or interested in asking the question, but if you are, please just unmute and ask. Until then, Mike, I was just wondering, as we look at blue and green infrastructure along traditional infrastructure, do you think it'll happen as it is now, where space transitionally will become more pedestrianized, but it's tarmac extension of the footpaths? And then what happens next? What are the next stages? Is it actually just doing one segment and doing a lot and introducing suds and landscape? Or is it planting trees along, is it more dispersed, or is it more concentrated ways of demonstrating what's possible?
It's strategizing at first. So, obviously there's going to be some more immediate kind of, changes that will have to deal with the current crisis. That will be kind of more immediate, but ultimately it's about strategically understanding what is the bigger opportunity. If we do it in an ad hoc nature and just do bits here, bits there and change it, then we're not going to get a coordinated and coherent kind of outcome. So, and blue-green infrastructure is always been, known from its environmental attributes, but obviously it's got huge social benefits and it's got huge economic benefits. And I guess what I think needs to be seen is the broader holistic overseeing nature of what blue-green infrastructure is, and then that needs to be embedded in into a city's planning model, and we're working a bit with Bristol, and that's something that Bristol's got an aspiration for, is kind of having a blue-green strategy that sits alongside the major city legislation, so it's kind of in parallel rather than kind of sitting lower down the kind of chain. So I think there is a really strategic role that it needs to play, and that's the only way you'll be able to unlock all these assets. Really is by looking at how they all interrelate, and therefore you can create a network of connected routes where people can cycle, walk and run, where habitat biodiversity can kind of embed itself within the city, where you can start to look at the social infrastructure such as recreational facilities, not just looking at them in traditional models where they sit in open spaces, but look at your streetscapes as well and opportunities to provide recreational opportunities there. There is, it requires a full coordinated strategy, and I'd say that's the first step that our cities need to adopt, is look at that, because if they do that, then you'll be able to start to see the benefits. And things like air pollution, for example, that's been voiced as one of the kind of attributes that's you're seeing a spike in people dying is because of the bad air pollution in cities. You're seeing obesity be a reason why COVID-19 has kind of impacted those societies and those groups. So it's going to be interesting, because cities then are going to have to start to kind of advocate for things that we've been all pushing for. But it's like COVID-19 and climate almost working hand in hand to kind of force our hand in actually changing this. And it's a really interesting time that, cities could be held to account. If your air pollution is bad, you're potentially putting those people at risk of a COVID outbreak or COVID death. So, I mean, this is early days. We're 2 months, 3 months into it, but I think it's a really interesting time. But I think if we holistically look at blue-green infrastructure strategically across this whole kind of platform of systems, then I think there'll be a far better outcome for our cities.
Great, thank you. Sorry, but David Greenfield's microphone isn't working, so we've got comments to read, so I'll read it. He was interested in the internal design of homes. More epidemics may mean more lockdowns. And certainly they're saying that with the climate crisis, we will get more epidemics. People are going to need private space within homes, as well as access to the outside. Homes may need to incorporate workspace for 1 or 2 more people, and we're likely to see growth in extensions, live workspace, garden offices, and basically situations where the recession means there's less money for larger homes. So actually, this immediate next steps when people are probably really trying to conserve money and they won't be able to make changes to their homes. What do we do? What do we suggest?
We've internally already started looking at internal layouts. It's a very good question, because this COVID-19 has thrown a huge problem in many of the families who are working with us. So for example, you've got a family where the husband and the wife are both working from home. They've got 2 children to look after, and they're living in a small 2-bedroom, 3-person apartment in central London somewhere, or perhaps in zone 2. And how do you make accommodation for spaces like this? I think far too long we've focused on wheelchair accessibility. All of those things are important. But how do you innovatively use circulation space within your layouts and use that effectively? So for example, your 2nd bedroom could have 1 desk space, which becomes the primary space as a study. So if you don't have a guest, you start using that. So starting to look at flexible internal use within even small flats. So for example, Hong Kong does that really well. Lots of density areas where 1 bedroom suddenly becomes studios or they become working spaces. I think that flexibility model within units internally has to be looked at more carefully. Some developers are kind of doing it, but more from the aspect of saying that we are going to sell this as a 2-bedroom, 4-person, when it actually is of an area of 2-bedroom, 3-person, which is 63 square meters. But even within 63 square meters, if you start looking at circulation spaces effectively, how do we start looking at storage? For example, at the moment, every bedroom has wardrobes. But if you start looking at storage innovatively and start looking at the floor to ceiling heights and just work with every square meter quite effectively. And as you say, people are not going to have money in their pockets to buy bigger units. How do you model smaller homes, family homes per se? Where do the children play? The other point I wanted to make also in high density places, your children are also going to be home most of the time. What aspects do we have within housing where every inch of external space could be used as play? So play doesn't have to be formal. It could be informal play areas, perhaps in your corridors where you've got double stack units. So there are innovative means of saying every inch and every square meter could be used effectively. And for me, that's what makes a true high density living model work. When every inch actually does work for people, as opposed to just stacking units above each other with very little regard given to not just aspect, but the internal spaces and square meters that we actually waste.
So do you think one of the quickest, easiest things we can do for the next homes being built would be just to increase the space, just bigger homes?
I think start looking at layouts internally. It might be within 65 square meters, you could start looking at layouts more inventively to start seeing where those study spaces could go. If you've got double stack corridors, where can play be integrated? If mums and dads are stuck at home with their children and they've got to entertain their children throughout kind of, the daylight hours of the day and even work from home. So I think it's just about using space innovatively as opposed to saying you need bigger homes. I think the space standards at the moment, if you look at the GLA space standards, they're fair. Some of them not so, some of them yes. Like when you go into the bigger homes category, your 89 square meters just does start to eat into your 3-bedroom units, and you don't get effectively a good third bedroom. But if we start easing spaces and start to really interrogate layouts, the standard layouts that are coming out, and look at all of these things that you've raised, I think that's a very good point. How do you use your internal space more effectively?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the comments, there's one by Ellie Thomas who was just talking about co-housing. They were saying they'd like to see more and new models of co-housing, and just even that statement makes me try and wonder what could that even be, because it could be quite interesting. Where we think in new ways about communal and shared spaces across a greater scale than just a home, we might work for a social bubble approach to social distancing as well. So it's just interesting to think what types of co-housing could happen, at what scales, and really what scale of a building as well, because you mentioned, Vinita, that a smaller mansion block could be a quite nice way to have overlapping social areas. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on co-housing.
Recently, I think is it an HTA scheme, if I'm not wrong, Scott, who have built an all women's co-housing scheme?
I
could be wrong, but I saw that in the news and I was very impressed. It's all these older women actually got together and they put their needs together and they said, in my individual home, this is what I want. And it took them 20 years to get this plan together because it was one of the first co-housing schemes. We're doing a bit of co-housing now and we're trying to get into that sphere. It can be complicated because of the land available, but I think more and more city councils will need to make this possible for co-housing to come on board, because it's a fantastic way of saying it's almost like another form of self-build, but you almost form a community even before you get into the co-housing. And I think there's less of architecture in it, but more to do with individual needs. And some of the schemes are absolutely fantastic, where you've not gone for all the fancy details, but you've gone for the basic amenities that people need on a day-to-day basis. So for example, this particular scheme that I'm talking about, I forget the name, but I'll send you a link to it later. I was looking at it, impressive. Women in their kind of 60s who were close to retirement just decided this is what they want. They want to be in a co-housing scheme, and each of them put forward their footprint for what they wanted within their homes. And that's been delivered by the architects. And I think that was a
really nice scheme with a really nice courtyard. And I remember seeing that, and someone wrote it's the PPE scheme in Barnett's, and there's a link there for people to follow it. I'm conscious that it's just about 6:30 as well, so the hour just flies by. I know that. I was just wondering if anyone in the panel if you want to give any final thoughts, or maybe what you'd like to see as the immediate next step in housing and public realm or parks, and just your wish or whatever it might be.
I can try and round up my part. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably summed it up in what I said in the little kind of presentation, but I do think this is an opportunity for the urban environment to really benefit humankind. I think society now has the opportunity to kind of take ownership of a lot more space. We can rethink our modes of transport, rethink our modes of working. But ultimately, the city is going to be still an important attribute of public life. So I think, as long as we're proactively valuing the public realm and investing in it, and I think investing is probably the word that hasn't been applied to a lot of public realm and parks for a long time. So I think investing in quality spaces and rethinking the planning model to adopt a far more myriad of spaces in our city fabric, we're going to have a far more vibrant place for people to prosper from.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, Vinita or Yolande?
Yeah, I've just been asked about sort of how we're going to afford all this extra space, and I think that's part of the urban dispersal story. I think the need for more space, for better neighbourhoods outside realm and so forth, is part of going to. It's not a disaster for the big cities. It's just reversing the tide, to use a kind of respiratory sort of metaphor. It's as if we've got very used over the last 30 years to big cities breathing everything in. They've just been sucking everything in. It's now, I think, the time for these big cities to exhale, and for the dispersal of people to alternative places where basically land is cheaper. That's how we're going to afford the sort of spaces that we need in future.
Thank you. And any final thoughts, Vinita? I know you have to actually run.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, I want to, on behalf of everyone, thank our panel of experts. It was a very interesting presentations and questions and answers. Like I mentioned earlier, we have an hour after this, much more informal. I guess everyone could just open their microphones at that stage. But anyone that wants to go, definitely feel free to go. Now's the time to leave very easily.